Good evening. Welcome to the ShadowTrader video weekly for Sunday, September 23rd, 2012. A couple weeks ago, I should say, like last week's commentary, wouldn't be last week's video, it'd be the video before. I was talking about resistance point in the S&P in the channel here, which pretty much touched to the penny. This has got to be actually moved in a little, so I think it's really got to be here to touch kind of a couple points here, and we broke right through it on the Fed. And since then, really, there's really been no sign really to get aggressively short. I would have thought that the market would have backed off from this level a bit harder, and it really hasn't at all. And my take on the markets right here is that basically they're just tired a little bit. So we can't seem to go higher this past week. You can see there was just a lot of chop, which I'll get into in a second. But at the same time, the tone out there is just really bullish, and there is a lot of professional money, I think, on the sidelines that missed these two moves because they were such a surprise. You know, the ECB move and then the Fed move, and a lot of that's probably going to come into play before the end of the year as these people chase. So that's what I think is basically happening. We had a false breakdown on Thursday, which I felt was interesting, that I'm watching very closely. That was in the S&Ps, and I'm going to show you something actually as well on the profile here. Here's our profile of the ES, and I'll move this over. This is the false break that I was talking about right here. This was on Thursday. And the reason I say false break is because everybody was really watching this 1450 really, really closely. And the reason for that 1450 being so key, and I discussed this in my blog a lot, is the fact that you have basically the low end of the channel here. Excuse me, not the low end of the channel. The low end of the distribution here, which is the main distribution on the Fed day. So here's your bubble where a good amount of the volume occurred. And very often what is known as the spike, which is this part, you can think of this kind of like a lollipop, and this is the stick. The top of the stick right here is usually support, and that's exactly what happened in the S&Ps. I know I'm drawing a horrible line here, but exactly what happened in the S&Ps, for a couple of days after that, here, and here, you found plenty of support right at that level. And then Thursday was interesting because what should have been a really ominous day in that there was multiple support levels broken and little support below us, because we know that the sort of the straight up move of the Fed here, that doesn't support much. It ended up being a false breakdown, and as a matter of fact, it was interesting that the market actually opened, which is right here. The little blue dot in the profile is the open. The market actually opened below that level, checked out some prices below it, but then after that just rejected those prices and bull stepped back in and rallied it back up. The market actually closed pretty strong that day. The asterisks are where the market closed. Friday was a relatively weak day. However, I'm not putting that much emphasis on it because it is options expiry, which is generally weak at the end of the day, and you can see that that's pretty much what happened here as traders essentially sold stocks off into the end of the day. Right in here, and they sold them basically away from value, which is up here. And this 1457 in the week to come is going to be key. I want everybody to remember this area because notice that you have 1, 2, and 3 points of control there, almost consecutive, and not really. I mean, they've got 2 days in between, but it doesn't matter. Within a short period of time, whenever the POCs start to get very clumped together and you have identical ones close by, I always pay attention to those levels. At the very least, you can very often initiate a good day trade in the ES against those levels because you know that POC is going to be really important. The market will spend at least some time there. All right, so that's a situation on the profile. Let's take a look at some other indices as well, and I also want to get into some stuff on the S&P in terms of what's holding up this market. Okay, so S&P chart on the daily, I'm actually going to flip to a weekly here, and we're just going to go through some of the majors here. So Indu, which is the Dow, excuse me, put in a doji on the week, and again, I'm not expecting too much. I'll show you some scenarios in a moment of what might happen here in the coming week. Nasdaq Composite as well, doji at the top. The reason I'm saying I'm not expecting too much fireworks here is that it just doesn't feel to me like a toppy pattern here, and the fact that there's really a lot of support below us. If we look at the S&Ps here, 20 MA is rising. I talked in a couple videos ago that we were getting too far overextended. We've now kind of corrected that by time. So this mush here really kind of takes a little bit of the froth out of the market. And I think it's kind of bullish that in taking out some of that froth, we didn't back off at all. Similar to this area, so this was probably holding up ahead of the ECB and the Fed maneuvers because under the hood things were strengthening and people just, I guess, wanted to remain long into that, and that obviously worked out for them. So you have S&P holding up here pretty well. Indu we already looked at. Let's look at NDX. Weekly chart on the NASDAQ 100, same thing, right? So what I find interesting is that notice that on the SPX, right, notice where you are relative terms, how the NDX powered up, over the high there, whereas SPX didn't. And one of the reasons for that is simply that you have this stock here that is really just holding things up really well. Notice that you just flatlined at the 700. The 700 mark did not show any signs of really like heavy selling in Apple. And one thing that you have to remember going forward when Apple is rallying so much is the simple fact that it has such a big weight in the S&P. So what I've done here is I've pulled up this fact sheet, which you can get just at standardandpoors.com. I actually look at this every now and then. It's kind of interesting to me. Usually on like a Friday night, sitting home alone, whatever, reading the S&P fact sheet. But anyway, these are the top 10 companies by weight in the S&P, and you should obviously draw your attention to right on the top. Look at Apple here. Look at how big the weight is in the S&P. 4.5%, right? So that's a lot. And obviously in the NASDAQ 100 it's even greater. I don't have that fact sheet up, but that is important. And if you want to really know where the S&P is going, or if you think that it's topping, it's bottoming, it's whatever, it's always a good exercise maybe to look at some of these top 10 stocks that have such a huge weighting in it. This total here I added up earlier is, I believe, 21.9%, give or take some tenth of a point if I remember my math correctly. I can't seem to draw a decimal with this thing. So anyway, this is like 22% of the S&P if you add up all these stocks. So if we look at, for instance, Exxon, Microsoft, IBM, we can just shoot this over to the side like so. Okay, so here is the first one, is obviously Apple, right? ExxonMobil is the second one. And again, just not really indicative of like a major like topping pattern where you shot up really high and you're just gonna completely crumble here. Plus a lot of support on the stock. GE's in that list, right? Same thing. Microsoft looks like it's just kind of slowly grinding higher. Really don't see anything that's indicative of like a major top here. It's not like you have a signal here like the big engulfing candle and then you're going to come a bit lower or anything. J&J is on that list, right? Let's see if I can't pull it up over here on the side so I can see them. Wells Fargo and Coke, right? Wells Fargo, a little bit weaker than the other ones. KO actually does look like it's rolling over, so that one is probably the weakest of the bunch. So anyway, I just thought that's a good exercise to do, just to take a look at that. But really my focus was to point out to everybody that Apple is such a huge weight, and that I just don't see the S&P like really collapsing while Apple holds up well. I think Apple still has more gains left in it. I do think it needs to catch up to this ascending trend line here and possibly the 20 MA as well. I don't think that I would be a buyer right in here. I would probably let the stock consolidate a little bit, but at the same time I would not be surprised at all if the stock starts to lift on its own without even coming to the trend line, because I've seen this happen before where stocks are at sort of a big round number. Everybody kind of thinks that's it, it can't go any further, and instead of selling off or consolidating, it just starts to lift gradually, and 3 days later it's 707 and then it's 712 and then the chasing begins, and a month from now the stock's 730 or whatever, and people just didn't, you just kind of don't believe it. A lot of times, remember, the biggest moves in the market always happen because the least amount of people believe in it. So I'm just throwing that out there as a scenario for Apple. I'm not currently long the stock. For me personally, I need to see a little bit of consolidation of the gain, but I'm just saying this could easily be the scenario in Apple in the coming weeks. All right. In last week's video, I gave you a great trade idea on ISRG, right? Last week's video was recorded right in here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days. Last week's video was recorded right in here as we had closed here on last week Friday. And I said you have sellers shut off from this move and the stock will be bullish in the coming weeks, or in the coming week. And I said watch this for a day trade on Monday, and lo and behold, it was a phenomenal on day trade on Monday. Anywhere over the 502, the stock was just like a rocket, and it just took off. So that worked out very well. Since then, and if you recall in the video, I said that not only would the stock be great here, but that if it can make it to 518, there would probably be a gap fill play in the stock. Notice that you have the major downtrend line here in the weeklies, ties right in. Stock could probably make it at least to 540 right in here, and that is essentially what has happened here on the setup. So I'm looking for ISRG long next week over the 518. I like the fact that it parked itself right at the 518, didn't back off at all. We know that Friday was a relatively bearish close in the S&P, and yet look what was happening in the stock. I mean, the buyers were just nibbling on it right into the close, and just, you know, they didn't want to let go at all, and the stock actually closed right at 518. So I think ISRG could definitely be in play in the coming week to the upside. All right, that's all I have for this week. Thank you very much. On behalf of myself and the entire ShadowTrader team here in beautiful Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, I wish you good trading and good night.